let's get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to GW. I'm Gwanhoo Kim, the Associate Director of GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWICS. Thank you for joining today's panel discussion on U.S. trade policy shifts and the future of the U.S. ROK economic relations. This event is co-hosted with the GW East Asia National Resource Center and the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy. Now let me turn it over to Celeste Arrington, Director of GWICS, and Nick Vonortas, Associate Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs and the Director of Institute for International Science and Technology Policy for opening remarks. Celeste.
Thank you very much, Gwanhoo, and thank you all for joining us here this afternoon. And I want to extend a special thank you to our speakers, including from online, for joining us today. My name is Celeste Arrington. I'm the director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies, or as we like to say, GWICS, as well as the co-director for the East Asian National Resources Center. And part of our mission at GWICS, as well as at the NRC, is to provide programming on a broad array of topics, especially through our Korea Policy Forum, which Gwanhoo organizes regularly. We try to tackle current topics of concern in the U.S. ROK relationship, as well as bringing in new and diverse perspectives on such current topics. So hopefully we will get that sense today from this event on a very timely topic about which everyone wants to know what's going to happen. I want to thank especially Gwanhoo Kim, my associate director at GWICS, for being the brains behind the operation for our Korea Policy Forum, as well as my program manager, Ravina Ugale, and program coordinator, Takara Askew, and the staff of the NRC for helping to make the logistics of this event possible. I also encourage you, especially the students in the room, to think of questions for our speakers, because we do hope to have a lively Q&A. So welcome again, and thank you for coming this afternoon. And I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Nick. Thank you.
Thanks, Celeste. Thanks, Gwanhoo. I want to welcome everyone here at the Elliott School this afternoon. This event indeed is great. The topic of the event is great, absolutely. Our institute, I am here primarily as representative of the Institute for Science and Technology Policy, but also as a representative of the Elliott School on the research side. These days are peculiar for universities. Administrations have changed and things have gone in different directions. If I had stood in front of you 5 years ago, of course, I would talk about globalization. And of course, I would talk about getting together and be happy, a happy family. These days, we need to confront things such as national security and terms that I never thought they existed, like technology sovereignty. I never thought of technology sovereignty in my 40 years in the business. I still cannot grasp that term, what it means, but here it is, and we have to deal with it. In this process, Celeste allowed me to also advertise yet another event that will happen a month from tomorrow, exactly. You will see big announcements and so forth. One of the most well-known experts in this town on science and technology innovation policy will deliver the annual Bromley Memorial event. Alan Bromley was the science advisor to President Bush Sr., and he was a prominent scientist, physicist in that case. So given the changes in the policy arena, we will this speaker, who is one of the most dynamic will sort of speak out. We asked him to speak out his mind about the way U.S. policy and international policy is developing in this arena. And I believe a Korean audience would very much be interested in the topic, because Korea, as we will hear today, is very much in international affairs, and its position internationally matters a lot. So without further ado, I will pass it to distinguished guests, and thank you very much for coming. If you see me leaving shortly, it's because I teach and I have that other to prepare classes and so forth. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
The first speaker is Gwanhoo Lee, a professor and chair of the Department of Information Technology and Analytics in the Koga School of Business at the American University. He's joining us virtually today. Gwanhoo has served as an advisor to South Korea's Presidential Committee on the Fourth Industrial Revolution and has consulted with Samsung on digital strategy and the World Bank on national digital strategies for developing countries. The next speaker is Melissa Griffith, a lecturer in technology and national security of its Institute for Cybersecurity Studies. And she is also a non-resident research fellow at the UC Berkeley's Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. Melissa has served as the Director of Emerging Technology and National Security and a Senior Program Associate with the Woodrow Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation Program. Last but not least, we have Henry Haggard. He is a Senior Advisor at WestExec Advisors, a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute at Rice University, a senior associate of the KFVUV Korea Chair at the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy, and a U.S. senior advisor at AmCham Korea. He's wearing a lot of hats, obviously. And last year, he completed a 25-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, specifically from 2021 to 2023, he served as the top advisor on Korean politics and managed the bilateral security relationship at the U.S. Embassy in South Korea. With that, let's begin with Gwanhoo. Gwanhoo, I'd like to start by asking, are you there?
Yeah.
I'd like to start by asking about the implications of U.S. trade policy shifts for South Korean investments and the supply chains. What do you make of it?
Thank you so much, Professor Kim, for a kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, my apologies for not being able to be there in person. I've been under the weather, just like many people got sick these days. But I'm delighted to join you today at this important forum to discuss the seismic shift in U.S. trade policy and its profound implications for South Korean industries. As we navigate the first month of the Trump administration, the global trade environment is once again undergoing significant shifts. Recent policy changes, particularly the imposition of higher tariffs, are poised to reshape U.S.-South Korea economic relations. South Korea conducts about $250 billion in annual trade with the U.S., and as a long-standing U.S. ally, South Korea is currently facing significant challenges. With the America First trade policy, Trump has made sweeping changes to U.S. trade policy, focusing on tariffs on imports from both rivals and allies. On February 1st, Trump issued an executive order imposing a 10% additional tariffs on all imports from China. He also imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports from all trading partners with no exceptions or exemptions, revoking South Korea's 2018 exemptions. This aligns with his broader plans for 25% tariffs on automobiles, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals by April. Then Trump signed a plan for reciprocal tariffs on U.S. trading partners. So these recent changes in U.S. trade policy represent a significant shift towards protectionism and could have substantial impacts on global trade dynamics. These policy changes carry the risk of escalating economic confrontations with both allies and rivals. With increased tariffs, while the increased tariffs aim to boost the domestic manufacturing and employment, they may disrupt global supply chains and provoke retaliatory actions that harm U.S. exporters. In fact, China has already announced retaliatory measures imposing 10 to 15% tariffs on select U.S. goods, such as crude oil, coal, and the LNG, and then agricultural machinery, and so on. So China also restricted exports of metals and critical minerals to the United States. The tariffs may undermine long-standing trade agreements with allies, potentially isolating the U.S. in the global trade arena. The reciprocal tariff strategy could lead to a cascade of tariff increases across countries. For businesses and consumers, these tariffs could result in increased costs for imported goods and potential disruptions in their supply chains. The impact may be particularly pronounced in industries relying heavily on steel and aluminum imports, or those with a significant trade relationship with China. So, for example, the CEOs of U.S. auto companies have expressed serious concerns about increasing costs due to tariffs. All this uncertainty created by the Trump administration makes it extremely difficult for companies to make any investment decision and develop long-term plans. So they are in constant chaos, in a sense. So how will the recent U.S. trade policy changes impact South Korean industries? I'll talk about a couple of industries, key industries for South Korea. In terms of semiconductors, Samsung and SK Hynix are responsible for about 70% of global memory chip production. And these companies now face existential risks from proposed tariffs. Furthermore, South Korea's $50 billion investments in U.S. semiconductor fabs, including Samsung's Texas expansion and SK Hynix Indiana packaging plant, now face uncertainty as the administration reviews the CHIPS Act subsidies. This review may lead to amendments to existing agreements, and the uncertainty surrounding these subsidies could influence future investment decisions and operational strategies. In particular, proposed reshoring requirements could force Korea-based companies to relocate advanced logic chip production currently concentrated in China within several months. With China accounting for 35% of South Korea's semiconductor exports, such a decoupling would disrupt trade while raising production costs by about 18 to 20% or so. In terms of automobile industry, South Korean automakers led by Hyundai and Kia exported about 1.3 million vehicles to the United States in 2024. However, Trump's proposed universal 25% auto tariff would upend this. For example, Hyundai ships 65% of its U.S. sales directly from South Korea. So it now faces profit margin compression of up to 19% under such tariffs. Even General Motors will be impacted by the higher tariffs as its entry-level models like Chevrolet Trax are made in South Korea and exported to the United States. For EVs, South Korean automakers have expanded production facilities in the U.S. to capitalize on Biden-era IRA subsidies. For example, Hyundai's $12.6 billion Georgia EV plant is slated to employ 8,500 employees by 2026. But Korean automakers now confront a 25% tariff on imported cold-rolled steel, a critical input comprising 30% of vehicle weight. Trump signed an executive order called Unleashing American Energy, which potentially will dismantle the EV tax credit. So while tariffs aim to boost domestic manufacturing and employment, the lack of consumer incentives could suppress EV demand growth. So this policy misalignment will jeopardize investments in battery factories like LG Energy Solutions' $4.3 billion Arizona facility. So to navigate the Trump administration's trade policies changes, South Korean government and companies are taking the following responses. I'll talk about 5 strategic responses. The first response is supply chain realignment. Korean companies will invest in diversified and resilient supply chains to reduce future vulnerabilities. For example, Hyundai has decided to localize battery production in Georgia under using raw materials from Canada. SK Innovation's partnership with Telum Metals for nickel mining in Minnesota further demonstrates this trend toward the vertical integration in the US. This illustrates the new calculus, absorbing higher costs to ensure tariff compliance. On the other hand, the South Korean government wants to strengthen its trade partnership with Canada as a hedging strategy against the US volatility. The two nations recently launched a 350 billion Canadian dollar trade financing initiative to diversify market access and co-develop critical technologies like EV batteries. The second response is increasing government-led financial and regulatory support. The South Korean government has pledged a 255 billion financing support for Korean exporters to mitigate negative impacts from changes in US trade policies. But good news actually is the South Korea's free trade agreement with US, the KORUS FTA, may help limit the impact of reciprocal tariffs. South Korea's tariffs were mostly eliminated by the free trade agreement signed in 2007 and revised in 2018 during Trump's first term. So actually the impact of reciprocal tariffs on South Korea could be less than people might think. The third response is increasing policy advocacy and lobbying. South Korean firms and government engage in active dialogue with US policymakers to advocate for fair trade practices, leveraging diplomatic channels and industry coalitions. At the same time, South Korea is amplifying lobbying efforts, emphasizing $230 billion investment, FDI, and over 800,000 American jobs created since 2017. And think tanks such as the KI are collaborating with corporate leaders to analyze tariff impacts and shape advocacy narratives. The fourth one is doubling down on innovation investments for securing technological leadership. South Korean firms are channeling resources into next-generation technologies to offset tariff-induced cost disadvantages. The government's 100 trillion Korean won tariff defense shield allocates 40% to R&D in semiconductors, batteries, and robotics. The National Research Foundation, NRF, has embarked 15 trillion Korean won for AI R&D. So these investments aim to solidify Korea's position in high-margin segments, which are less susceptible to tariff pressures. Finally, the fifth response is building collaborative frameworks. The U.S. ROK Critical Minerals Partnership, finalized in February this year, ensures preferential access to lithium and rare earths for Korean battery companies. Similarly, joint ventures in shipbuilding leverage South Korean expertise to meet U.S. defense needs while securing tariff exemptions. South Korea's decision to join the CPTPP in 2022 signified a strategic shift toward Asia-centric trade blocs, and this agreement provides alternative markets for South Korea's exports. Additionally, collaboration with the OECD on tariff dispute mechanisms offers a procedural counterweight to unilateral U.S. measures. So all in all, in conclusion, there is no doubt that U.S. trade policy shifts under the Trump administration present significant challenges, even existential threats to South Korean companies. And navigating this uncertain trade landscape requires strategic foresight, collaborative efforts, and unwavering commitment to innovation and mutual growth. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Gwanhoo, for your comprehensive overview of the challenges and opportunities, if you will, that the South Korean companies are facing now. I understand the biggest challenge for the businessmen, I mean, every businessman, they want to avoid at any cost is uncertainty. So I think we can discuss a little bit more about that big variable later on. Let me move on to the next topic. Melissa, I'd like to ask you about U.S. trade policy and its strategic goals, particularly in two areas. First, U.S. expectations for South Korean investment, its role in reshoring, supply chain resilience, and technological cooperation. Second, the policy outlook and bilateral cooperation, how both countries can navigate challenges and strengthen economic ties. Gwanhoo briefly touched upon those issues, but I'd like to ask you to discuss this issue from a U.S. perspective.
Thank you so much for having me. So my background is on national security, emerging technology and technologies, and how that relates with economic statecraft. So my flavor of this talk is going to kind of focus on this intersection between economic policies and national security policies with a really strong lens on two technologies, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, because even those two questions are tall marching orders for 10 minutes or less. So I'm going to try to streamline those comments a little bit. Some through lines that you'll see throughout what I'm talking about today are the kind of changing role of technology in U.S. policy. And that's not a new conversation. I'm actually going to trace that over about the last 6 years, so provide some historical context. Heading into this moment, I do think the term is uncertainty, even in these two areas. And the other is the kind of widening of the aperture on economic tools that the United States, but also partner countries are willing to deploy for national security purposes. And so we'll sort of talk about those three kind of trend lines. I'm going to do that by tracing this intersection between AI and semiconductors. So kind of asking the question to the room, how is it that the semiconductor industry, which is by no means an emerging technology industry, it's been around since the 40s into the 50s and the 60s and onward, so a long-standing industry, how did they find themselves sort of in the crosshairs of US national security policy in the last 6 or 7 years? And that's very much a story about artificial intelligence, a story about allies and cooperation, about trade blocs and economic statecraft, and also just a story about deep uncertainty as we plow through. I'm a social scientist, so I'm going to list out what I'll do in order and then attempt to deliver it in order. So I'll try to address things along 4 axes. What are the national security concerns with AI that has driven this kind of current policy moment across administrations? What is then of those national security concerns place semiconductors front and center as an economic statecraft lever that you might want to focus on? I'm going to touch very, very briefly on what we mean when we say AI chips. It will be the world's fastest flash talk on technology. So if there's more questions there, we can address it a little bit more broadly, and then end with sort of the implications for US and Korea going forward in this space. So when we think about national security AI and the kind of driving of the last at least 4 to 5 years of US policy in this space, there's been 4 major categories of concern that have animated the types of levers we wanted to reach for. The first is the existential set of questions. Often buzzwords here are things like AGI, artificial general intelligence, or ASI, artificial superintelligence. And the focus is on the technology suites or the sets of technologies in combination or as a single product that gets deployed, posing an existential threat either to the future of work or to humanity in a variety of formats. This is the kind of area of concern I have the least worry about, but we can talk about why that is. There are many people, I think, in this town as well as more broadly. We saw some of them at the AI Action Summit, for example, that this sort of dominates their day job. But there's the existential bucket. There's also below that what we would consider application-specific risks in this space, and this tends to be where you're concerned about how artificial intelligence is deployed. So I'm worried about artificial intelligence in the nuclear enterprise, for example, because it's a high-risk application, and I want to make sure it's not destabilizing in some regard. Or I'm really interested in understanding how artificial intelligence is deployed in very specific, sensitive national sectors economically. because I think those might be destabilizing or provide insecurity in some ways. So the focus there is not on existential, it's on the application set itself. The third, which I think we've already name dropped several times in this room, is geostrategic. The kind of buzzword there, if you've got your buzzword bingo cards ready, is China. Right? And here it's a big sort of set of concerns around AI as a source of national power and the ways in which that revolutionizes economies, but also AI as a potential military advantage on the battlefield. And a lot of US policy has specifically referenced that military component of that geostrategic conversation. And then the last one is the security or insecurity of artificial intelligence itself. And this is where you'll find a lot of the conversations in the AI safety debates, cybersecurity ethics, bias, reliability in this space. We'll focus in on the models or the data sets, artificial intelligence as the category, and how do you make sure that's safe and secure going forward. Of those four buckets, this is a flash talk, of those four buckets is the geostrategic that is most heavily put semiconductors and a lot of our conversations with the United States and South Korea in the limelight. So this concern around China and the concern around the resilience of supply chains given that environment in this space. Why semiconductors? This industry, I think, has a couple important features to note in the current policy moment from a national security angle. One, it makes up one of the three core ingredients you need for any artificial intelligence application, that being data, algorithms, and compute being semiconductors, the devices that house them, and the data centers that house them, and the electricity grids that provide power to them. So it's 1/3 of what you need in addition to talent, making that 1/4 for a successful AI program in this space. It also tends to be a tangible good. Software is much harder to focus your economic statecraft policies on, particularly if you want to prevent proliferation. When you're dealing with tangible physical assets, it's a very different commercial fold and flow that you might be able to exercise some control over. It's also an area that is historically has very few players in that supply chain, although it is quite global. And in key components of that, the United States and key allies, South Korea being one of them, occupy significant positions of strength. So you have some opportunities potentially to go from chokeholds into choke points, or the reverse, choke points into chokeholds in that space, which makes it a very kind of promising area to focus on if you're looking to sort of exercise economic statecraft in this area. I think it's important to recognize that as we look at the sort of policy portfolio that the United States has leveraged, which has a strong, I think, trilateral component between the United States, Japan, South Korea, as well as a different trilateral, the United States, Japan, and the Dutch in this space. There's many a trilateral when it comes to semiconductors, is the US is trying to intervene on 3 axes when it comes to economic policy and trade policy being one of those. One is the promote side of this question. The United States is not alone in pursuing pretty robust industrial policy. South Korea is notable in this regard as well around semiconductors, the CHIPS Act being one of those pretty seminal pieces that does not have its origins under the Biden administration, has gone through a variety of iterations through Congress before it finally hit in the CHIPS and Science Act. Its final version. So you have this industrial policy very focused on growth at home, which both countries in this conversation today have been quite active in. You also have the kind of prevent side of this conversation where you are very much hoping to prevent the flow of your technology abroad in these spaces. And this is where I think the conversations around export controls that have been very thorny and destabilizing and uncertain for the two countries in question in the last 4 years take center stage, as well as outbound investment. And then you have the prevent side of that, which is the CFIUS types of reforms where you're worried about investments coming in and not allowing that kind of influence in your domestic market. So what do we mean by AI chips in this space? I do want to kind of flag that it's a diverse ecosystem. We tend to buzzword that down just to AI chips, but they take a variety of forms and they sit across the industry, from design firms to manufacturing firms. They're not always leading edge node chips, which tends to be what we focus on most heavily. And given that diversity, different companies are actually competitors of each other's across these two countries in question today, but also occupy different positions of strength. So if you look at the South Korean ecosystem, Samsung and SK Hynix are navigating the last 6 years of geopolitical and economic uncertainty in very different ways. And part of that story is not just where they sit in the semiconductor supply chain across the various segments, but their relationship with AI and the AI boom. So what am I looking for in the next couple months or the last couple months and looking forward? I do want to emphasize as we look at the current moment that uncertainty has also been a pretty big buzzword of the last 4 years. If you sit in the semiconductor industry space, there's been significant changes from 2019 onward, heavily in the export control domain here, from the kind of Huawei 5G conversations to October. There's a series of Octobers here, October 2023, October 2022, and then late fall 2024. Very, very focused on semiconductors and preventing their proliferation to China, often at the expense of global trade flows, which has been a very complicated situation for our industry to navigate. I think it is worth flagging as well as the South Korean industry navigate. I think it is also important to note as we look to the next administration that there is a lot of uncertainty just in how this will unfold, but also just what the policy priorities will be. And I'll give a couple examples there. Export controls, there's those 3 iterations of those rules. There's also the diffusion policy, the AI diffusion policy that hit in the last weeks of the Biden administration out of their Commerce Department at BIS, and that created 3 tiers of countries, all focused on preventing the diffusion of chips, mostly to China, but also going through second countries to get there. Notably, in that first tier of countries, those tight partners, it's very, very small, that pool. And while South Korea is one of those countries, many are not. And it creates a lot of uncertainty around how industry can sell those chips on, because many of the firms they're selling on to may be sitting in the UK, but have co-ownership or may have strong ties into other countries in those spaces. And we just don't know. It's been very controversial, that policy, even as it was implemented in the US. It's in the comments period and will go in effect, I think it's in May in this space. And it is deeply uncertain whether it will go forward, if it will be pulled back in some format, if that tier 1 will be expanded or radically shrunk in terms of trusted countries. It's also an area that the EU is taking serious umbrage with because of the single market concern. Not all EU countries are in that category as well. I think also as you're looking to this space, there's just incredible uncertainty about the future of national security and technology in the conversation. There has been wide agreement in the United States across both the Obama administration, the previous Trump administration, Biden, and the current Trump administration, that technology and national security will animate US policy, but the contours of that look radically different across those administrations. And there's some concern that in the next coming 4 years, these very substantial and disruptive policy arrangements may not be as durable as one was hoping in the industry. We're trying to adjust to that, but that some of these economic statecraft tools may become more transactional in nature versus national security flavored as they push forward. But happy to talk about any of these in more detail. I think I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you, Melissa. I think you briefly touched upon the economic security issues, which leads to Henry's topic. And I think based on Gwanhoo and Melissa's discussion, I think shows that the South Korean companies are having more and more reasons to distance themselves from their investment or economic relationship with China. And I'd like to ask you, Henry, for your insights on the key strategic risks and opportunities in U.S.-South Korea trade relations.
Thanks, and thanks to my 2 speakers. I think it was a great laydown of the challenges that we're looking at, especially from the new administration we have in the United States. What I like to do is look at a little more at the political situation and how that shapes the strategic outlook, and then the people involved, how they might have an effect and how they might give us some insight on what we could expect going forward, and then wrap up with China, which is something that we've all been touching upon. But I think that's really the frame for the geopolitical direction or the relationship going forward in trade and otherwise. First of all, this is I'd like to say it's unique, but with South Korea, political uncertainty and turmoil is periodic. So, and maybe this is not, so there's not the impeachment and subsequent the court proceedings that are going on in South Korea. It's just, we just had something similar 8 years ago, 9 years ago. So, but what we're seeing now is with an acting president in South Korea and a new Trump 2 here, as well as a likely next president in May, there's a lot of uncertainty about how the political leadership can manage the new trade the new lay of the land in the trade space. So what we see is this uncertainty, because a greater degree of uncertainty that you were talking about, because you have the acting president in South Korea who is not really able to engage. You have a likely liberal next president in South Korea who has no real policies on record. And if they are on record, they indicate uncertainty, more uncertainty, because they indicate a flexibility of approach, not necessarily pro or anti anything particularly, but actually you might see both pro and anti if you look back on Lee's record. So what that means is that, and then of course the new Trump administration, where they're rolling out new trade approaches and policies day by day. So what I think this means is that there's a lot of potential for this to go horribly wrong. But I think there's also a real opportunity to manage this correctly. And managing, I think, what it would look like is that you see that the Trump administration sees South Korea as a key component of the China puzzle, both economically and geostrategically, that whomever comes into the next administration in South Korea sees their first, second, third, and fourth task to adjust to and manage the new policies that are coming out from the Trump administration rather than standing up to them, which would likely be the case. But again, that's an opportunity. And then, as I said, if the opportunity is that the Trump administration sees South Korea as a key part of the China puzzle, and by that meaning their overall focus on competing with China. So how I think this political puzzle might play out is really, and with the uncertainty that we have now with the acting president, I think is relying on the people involved right now, even more so than in the past, where you might say, okay, the president's relationship, that'll really determine, or the key economic advisors would determine how trade policy lays out and how things evolve. Absent with the level of uncertainty we see on the political stage, the people involved that have been named, such as in the Trump administration, folks like the National Security Advisor, Deputy National Security Advisor, the new Undersecretary for Political Affairs when she is confirmed. These are all folks who are quite familiar with Korea, and I think would see the value that Korea does, and could play as part of the trade and geostrategic approach of the Trump administration. But even more so, I think you have the conglomerates, the business leaders from South Korea, who have the most important role to play. We saw them trying to playing that role last week when a number of them, the 20, wasn't the top 20, but 20 key chaebol leaders or companies representatives came into Washington to try and make their case, to explain that Korea is about investment in the U.S. It's not about the trade deficit. And I think if they can tell that's the story of the couple $100 billion that have been invested in the last several years into the United States, and not and have that be the focus of the Trump team, and rather than the $54 billion trade deficit from 2024, if they can tell the story of the fact that Korea was the number one foreign direct investor in the United States last year by 20% over the number two economy, which was Taiwan. If they can tell that story, then there's a chance that the Trump administration will, as its policy evolves, they will see Korea as playing a more useful role. And now, what I think specifically that means is you see the how Korea could fill in on shipbuilding, how they could help in mineral security, civil nuclear, and also on the trilateral area as well, on the chips, as you mentioned. Specifically on the shipbuilding, this is something that I think there's real opportunity for the relationship to be a real a boost for the relationship, because it is acknowledged that, that U.S. by President Trump, first and foremost, that the U.S. shipbuilding the industry is essentially non-existent. In his first call with then President Yoon, they discussed the potential of working together with South Korea companies. So present, of course, there are legislative hurdles in the United States, but what I'm talking about with Korean businesses and what people are discussing is a push to modernize the Jones Act to allow greater participation by Korean companies in the shipbuilding industry in the United States. And I think that could be, that's a big political task, but it could have a profound effect on how we're looking at all the topics that the other speakers mentioned in their presentations. Likewise, on January 9th, the U.S. and Korea signed a new MOU on cooperation in civil nuclear field. This is after years of legal dispute between Westinghouse and KEPCO. It's not entirely over, but my understanding is this soon will be over and allow Korea's project in Czechia, I think it's $5 billion, a several billion-dollar project to go forward. But more importantly, could allow for Korea and the United States to cooperate on civil nuclear projects domestically and abroad. These are the type of and again, this is of course fits into energy, fits into AI, also fits into the China puzzle. Because who would be exporting nuclear reactors, whether small modular reactors or more traditional reactors, to all the countries that are looking for more, whether that's the United States or all the countries that we have been signing 1, 2, 3 agreements over the past years in order to allow a hopeful expansion of nuclear capacity to satisfy energy demand, not just from AI, but from the 300 million people who will be turning on air conditioners for the first time in the next 5 or 10 years in India. There's going to be a great increase in energy demand from mostly across Asia, but globally. And the cooperation that Korea can provide could help reframe the conversation about Korea and about the trade relationship. So I know we're running out of time, but I think that the real challenge here is for the United States to look at Korea as an additive piece of their construction of a comprehensive approach to China on trade. I think that right now the uncertainty that you mentioned, Melissa, is quite high politically. I think that if Korea can get through this likely presidential election period unscathed without too much friction on whatever the new policies are coming from Washington, I think there's a real opportunity for the team here in Washington that does know Korea and does know the potential it represents to have that set up for a positive outcome.
Thank you. I appreciate your remarks, Henry, because you highlighted a lot of opportunities so that we can have a kind of balanced view of the current situation. Before your remarks, we're a little bit, less optimistic. So before I open it up for a roundtable discussion, I'd like to remind the virtual audience that we're taking questions from you, and the Q&A box is already open. So please make sure when you type in your questions, you identify your name and affiliation. So let me ask the speakers to make some comments or ask questions on the other speakers if you have any. And while you're preparing your comments and questions, let me ask Gwanhoo. Gwanhoo, are you there?
Yes.
So Henry talked about South Korea's uncertainty issue, basically surrounding the domestic politics. And this morning I read a news report about South Korean, the major opposition party is considering about introducing an act like an IRA-like act in Korea, basically addressing the problem of South Korean companies investing overseas but not having enough opportunity to invest domestically. How do we address these challenges? That kind of thing. So can you briefly address the uncertainty in South Korea down the road?
Yes. Yeah, happy to do that. So the uncertainty is a really key risk for any business, but especially for industry like semiconductor, because semiconductor industry requires long-term planning and heavy investment and long-term investment to be competitive. Now, companies like Samsung and SK Hynix are facing uncertainties coming from the US as well as coming from within South Korea. Especially right now, we do not have the strong leadership team in place. And also within a few months, the leadership in the government could go either way. And then people may have their own ideas about who's going to be the next leader in the government, but we never know what's going to happen. So from business leaders' standpoint, their best strategy right now is to hold their investment until things are becoming a little bit more clearer. But holding the investment also doesn't help them very much because standing still means you are getting behind your competition. So hopefully South Korea's political turmoil and then chaos will be addressed by the court and then by the election sooner than later. But to be honest, even after the new election, and even after the new administration is going to be in place, for the several next months, things will be pretty up in the air, and then there'll be a lot of political divide going on in people. So I'm not very optimistic about Korean politics for this year. And hopefully by end of this year, things will be a little bit settled down, and then the business leaders have more clear idea about where the new government policy, industry policy is heading, so that they can actually direct their investment decisions to the right direction. But yeah, so uncertainty coming from both countries doesn't really help Korean companies, especially semiconductor and automobile companies that require long-term investment.
Thank you. Henry and Melissa, do you have any comments, questions?
I'll lob one at you, Henry. So I really appreciate, I think, the conversations around areas of optimism in terms of thinking about this space, whether you're looking at sort of resilience of the semiconductor supply chain. There's been ample conversation about the importance of South Korea in that conversation. But I'd actually like to hear a little bit more from you on the energy side of some of your comments. So this has been, I think, a critical area of debate globally, as well as in the United States and in South Korea. The focus there being that the sort of AI future, which is as much economic as it is anything else, is heavily dependent on really upscaling very, very quickly energy infrastructure, both for the AI innovation ecosystem we're looking at, but most heavily for AI deployment as it starts to take off much more meaningfully. There's obviously some challenges there around sustainability, but some incredible opportunities as both countries are really looking to keep pace and increase investments there.
Yeah, I think South Korea has shown that they're one of the few places, if maybe, or the only from non-China Russia side of the team that can build nuclear power plants on time and basically on budget. So that's what we're at now. What experts say is that over the next 20, 30 years, there could be over $1 trillion of investment in nuclear power plants. That's a conservative estimate. Because of the demand and really no other significant way to increase capacity for demand to answer the energy demand. So huge amounts of money at stake, and Korea really the only real actor that can produce, whether it's Hyundai Engineering, it's KEPCO, they can produce currently. And the expectation or the hope is that they can now, without the legal kind of hurdles that were attached to the Westinghouse dispute, there can be greater cooperation, both in the practical construction of all these plants, but also in the commercial advocacy from the United States and South Korea. Since we don't have a dog in the fight, really, except for perhaps on the SMR side, we can be working together as we're looking at markets overseas. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if there are South Korean companies who are engaging in the construction part of partnership with Terra or NewScale or other the SMR companies in the United States, but especially abroad. I think there's also opportunity for South Korea to, as you mentioned, they fill in on the supply chain, whether it's in the minerals side of things or that's on the production side. On wind, they have an opportunity to be part of the solution they have some of the best wind turbine technology. They have a plant in Colorado, CS Wind, that's one of the largest, and a lot of investment in that space. So there's both a chance to be the big producer, but also to fit into the supply chain that is going to be necessary for continued economic growth. So I'd like to just back to you, Melissa, on just to go a little further on you mentioned some of the cooperation issues in AI. With AI being really nascent in the regulatory space, I'm wondering how optimistic you are that with our new administration and, to be able to work with South Korea, possibly with Japan, on the various areas of policy making going forward to allow coordination. I think with that, I see that South Korea has aspirations to be in this space, but not really encouraging of some of the digital tech, the big companies with things like thoughts of a platform law or things like this, cloud adoption relatively slow. How does that fit in with the super high tech and advanced technology, the opportunities with trilateral? We'd like to hear a little more about that. That'd be great.
So I'm going to say I'm optimistic because I choose to be in this space. So I'm going to just start from a place of optimism. When faced with uncertainty, let's be optimistic, I think, on some of these areas. I think down the stack, we've already seen pretty deep cooperation. So the ecosystems that make up artificial intelligence, both on the innovation, so a lot of the things you see in the news are raw innovations that we've seen, whether those are the release of new open models that are coming out, or it's the kind of emergence of things like reasoning models or LLMs. They're very innovation focused in that regard, but we're also seeing pretty significant shifting global cooperation toward deployment. The AI summit in France is a big indicator of that had upward, I think, of 60 signatories on their final communique in that space. So increasing sort of global attention on those governance areas that I think are quite promising. The areas that I would say pose some unique challenges, and this isn't necessarily unique to the United States and South Korea, are twofold, and they relate to two promises. One being this concern around China and competition with China and what the appropriate response that should be in the appropriate governance structures. There's been a lot of debate about how integrated China should be into some of these conversations or not. And the second is, I think, given to the opening remarks, this very strong tendency or inclination that if we're going to see innovation and deployment, it should happen at home. And I think there is a tension point here from the United States looking more broadly, but we're by no means the only country with this tension point. And that's where I'm a little bit less optimistic, because I think buried below the geopolitics, and this is emerging in a lot of the conversations we're having here, buried below the geopolitics are firms and companies that are direct competitors for each other across these countries. And they have very serious economic interest in coming out in wonderful condition in the market and actually out competing each other commercially. And that sits underneath the broader geopolitical endeavor in that space, and they're not necessarily aligned. And there's some areas where I think this is going to be some tension. So a personal concern of mine in this space on export controls is that the United States will increasingly go it alone. Will implement more and more controls vis-a-vis China without the allied support that they need, which is deeply troubling, I think, given the comments you've had in the room around how integrated they are. If that's the case, we don't end up sharing technology with China, but our firms, direct competitors in other countries, including places like South Korea, do. And that creates basically a lot more resources and funds that go into those firms that then outcompete U.S. firms in their own sort of innovation life cycle in the space. So that's a personal concern of mine that creates, I think, a lot of opportunity. If we want to maintain a lot of the advantages in the space, then we must cooperate across these borders. But I will say there's this dual tension of the China question, and at the same time that I would like, if we're going to have leading edge innovation, ideally I would want that at home being echoed across a lot of U.S. policy.
Thank you. Gwanhoo, do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, so I have a question for Melissa. So over the last few years, even Biden administration has been strengthening export controls for semiconductors and those advanced emerging critical technology against China. But now we have a DeepSeek shock, right? So that kind of questions the efficacy of that export control. So what do you think went wrong, and then what can you do more in terms of export controls to make sure that critical technologies we ban export to China actually doesn't they don't go there, and then but it looks like China managed to get those technology and then chips and equipment. So what's your view on that?
Yeah, so I think the export conversation, and to be fair, the outgoing administration has not spoken on export controls with a unified voice, which I think has also created some confusion in this space. But there's sort of two rationales that get floated for export controls. One, which is actually the traditional way of thinking about export controls, is it's a national security measure and you don't care about economics. So in that space, you don't actually care what China does as long as you're not selling the technology. And that's historically actually how the U.S. has always approached export controls. The last 5 years are a bit of a U-turn on U.S. export control policy. It's systematically different than what we've seen before. So if that's your marker for export controls, then they worked in the sense that you didn't sell it. And that's sort of the end of the story. I think the problem is that was not some sort of framed it that way. That was not the dominant framing. The dominant framing, as you're correctly pointing out, was about leads, right, in this space, and preventing proliferation of technology much more broadly. I think there's two things to kind of note there. I don't think it's a fair test to look at DeepSeek and say export controls didn't work. When you look at the technology that underpins DeepSeek, so for those that aren't familiar, DeepSeek, company out of China, just put out a very impressive reasoning model. It's open source, meaning it's open weight. So the weights of the model are public, very permissible licensing, which means that you can use it wherever you would like. You can integrate it into other models. You can download your own instance. Or if you're not very technically minded, you can also just go download their app, but that brings privacy concerns. Maybe don't do that one in this space. Very interesting model. And they did it on non-export controlled chips, which is, I think, an important part of the story. There's been some misinformation there, but there hasn't been substantiated evidence that they did that by getting their hands on chips that were not export controlled in that space. It is surprising to no one who worked in that area that they developed a domestic ecosystem. That's exactly what you do with the ambitions that you had in place that predate U.S. export controls. This is a high-tech industry, both within China. It's an area they have sustained focus on. And they did have some existing industry players. They have incredible talent and expertise in this space. So it's not surprising that it happened. I think the deeper sets of concerns there, one is that there is still an area where compute bites pretty significantly in that DeepSeek story. There was some initial coverage that was focusing on one portion of training and what chips were used for that. And it sort of then was used to talk about all compute. So it made it look like it was less compute intensive than it was. But even leadership in China and within the company itself have indicated that compute is one of their biggest challenges, access to compute going forward. And developing your own industry is pretty resource intensive. I think if I were to assign a report card with a lot of humility, because these are very complicated areas to govern in, and they're very challenging when you do them multilaterally, it would be that the United States did not partner enough of our prevent, protect mechanisms, which sit more heavily in the executive, with promote mechanisms. So if we're seeing a China catching up, that says much more about what we're doing domestically within our own industries and our ability to work collaboratively across markets in allies and friend countries alike to develop that expertise and to continue to run faster. If you are just chucking sand over your shoulder, eventually you still catch up, right? In that space, you have to keep moving. But I don't necessarily see it as a failure of export controls as they were sort of played out, but I do think it was a failure of the promise of export controls that they would, to some extent, in the way they were being deployed, and be given that they weren't accompanied by that full breadth of toolkit, that we just can see that they're not going to deliver on enduring leads if we're not able to maintain that systematically over time, but also really invest in it.
Thank you. I have one last question for the speakers before I open it up for a Q&A. So we have been talking about uncertainties, many uncertainties coming from Trump's trade policy shifts, whether it's intended or not. And my understanding is Trump has 4 more years to go to be at the White House. And we have, midterm elections in 2 years. But when it comes to investment decisions for like South Korean companies, it's something they have to consider in a longer term, not 2-year or 4-year, probably even longer. So in that kind of situation, what can you tell to the South Korean, chaebol leaders about their investment decisions? It's very political, and it's always is political economic decisions to make, right?
I mean, just briefly, I'd just say that this Korean conglomerates they've put all their chips on the United States. So I think that decision has been made. So I don't think this is something they're going to be able to change on it. They might slow the pace at which they make new commitments and new investments, but South Korean companies see the United States as the market of choice. It's where the cooperation exists. It's where all the connections are. I think that you're exactly right, that I think they're seeing how can they weather the next 4 years, seek the opportunities to make it as positive as possible. But this is a long-term play. I mean, Korean companies have been moving out of China during Moon Jae-in, which was in theory a pro-China period of 5 years. Over a half of South Korean factories moved out of China. So the move has been made. The matter now, the challenge is not to change the U-turn, but just to manage.
Okay. Melissa or Gwanhoo, do you have anything to add?
Well, I agree with Henry that I don't think Korean companies should change their direction in terms of where they should invest. So they'll continue to invest in the United States. But again, as Henry pointed out, it's the pace, they can control how fast or how slowly they can actually invest in the United States, depending on the political situation, depending on the landscape of policy changes and also a technology ecosystem. But at the same time, Korea also has to manage Korea-China relationship very, very well, because China is the biggest trading partner for South Korea. So South Korean companies are in a very tricky position now to walk the fine line between US and also between China. But again, the Samsung, SK, and then LG, they continue to invest in the United States, but they will have to make their investment work by working with the policymakers, by working with the American business, the counter partners, and also politicians and so on. So I think that's the choice they have. They have to make their investment work.
Emphasize with new administrations come new opportunities to rebalance some of these policies. And so I do think through a lot of this investment, and I agree with the comments that came before, there is an opportunity to kind of weigh back in on a set of policies that I do think aired more toward prevent at the expense of promote, both for South Korean industry, but also for the US industry and the global industry, to kind of actually weigh in a little bit with those investments and potentially tailor some of those policies that we saw over the last 4 years to be a little bit more advantageous economically.
Okay, with that, let me open up for Q&A. Lady.
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions for all the 3 speakers. So the first question is how South Korea is going to navigate the relation with China at this moment. So is the relations with China going to be fading for the sake of relations with the United States? Or does South Korea still view China as a key trade partner, an important market, and South Korea still want to keep the relations with China going? So that's the first question. And the second question is that I am confused with the end goals of export control policy because national security for me is a very broad concept. So specifically, what is the real goal of the United States? Is it to slow down China's military modernization or to cripple China's economy, or just to simply protect the U.S. hegemony and prevent China from becoming a technology provider in the world? And this also trigger another related question is that the U.S. export control policy will need the collaboration of other allied countries, but at the same time, the U.S. is imposing higher tariff on the allied countries. So that seems to me a dilemma in the U.S. policy. Thank you.
Can you identify yourself?
I'm a John Fellow with East West Center. Thank you.
Well, I can speak to address the first question, maybe not the second one. But so as I mentioned before, China is the largest trading partner for Korea. So as you know, South Korea's economy heavily relies on exports. So we cannot afford to lose either US or China. So we have to keep them both happy, right? As you know, so that's the challenge. And then obviously, the US views China as a threat or also major competition. Then what does that mean to South Korea, right? So I think the South Korean companies, industries need to continue to nurture, the strong relationship with China in many sectors, industries, to the extent that they're allowed by the United States, the policy and regulation, because right now South Korea cannot afford to go against the U.S. trade policy, because not only economic security but also national security depends on the strong partnership with the U.S. So I don't think I have an answer to that, but the bottom line is I don't think Korean government leaders are interested in losing any of these, the strong partners. So they will want to keep China and U.S. As close as possible. But that's the politics. That's the the art of politics. How you navigate that the challenging landscape.
Can I just offer a slightly different take on that? South Korea has one ally, which is something I think is important to remember for both the geopolitics as well as economics, and that ally is the United States. And this is not, I agree with the general sentiment that, Korea needs to have good relations with China, but as far as the preservation of its economic leadership role, I think it's important to underscore and note, where does all the high tech go? South Korea they're investing in China, trying to sell to China, but all the high tech is coming here. All the cooperation is with us. Their alliance is not just a military one with the United States. It's economic and technological. I don't say that, again, not disagreeing with what you're saying, but I just want to, I don't think it's as nuanced as you put it. I think that South Korea has, they've seen over and over again that China is, they can turn off the spigot at any moment. After the THAAD deployment, South Korea saw that China was not acting in its best interest. So Korea, I think, is trying to see how they can reduce reliance and not lose, again, IP to China while still being able to sell to China.
I think I'll address the second question, the two-parter in the second question. So the first being, what is the sort of articulated U.S. national security interest? And I think the reality is there are multiple national security interests, which make this a very complicated space. And they don't always align. They're not always mutually reinforcing. They're often in competition with each other. So, for example, there is a resiliency supply chain conversation that definitely hit its peak, both in terms of the 5G conversation in the United States and what it meant to have single points of failure across those, or geographically concentrated, but also significant reliance on a frenemy, enemy, rival, whatever language you would like to use in that space, and what that meant for your stability of your ecosystem, is particularly if that was critical technology, in that case, critical infrastructure. That's expanded into the supply chain conversation for semiconductors more broadly, both in they relate to 5G, but also I think COVID was pretty revealing in a lot of those conversations, as well as some pretty concerning choke points, fabrication being one of those, that front end manufacturing, where over 90% of these leading edge chips being located within Taiwan and TSMC. Sea, which is a geographically precarious region, but also on the Pacific Ring of Fire. So also volcanically a little bit precarious in some of those spaces as well, for wanting to diversify. That's one set of concerns. And it's kind of, to a certain extent, China agnostic, right? You want to avoid choke points. You want to diversify globally. That runs counter to, I think, a lot of the kind of sovereignty or onshoring conversations there, being able to maintain competitive advantages or build competitive advantages in those spaces. It's not necessarily a resilience posture, but it is sort of an economic security posture in those spaces. And then on the flip side of that, you have the AI kind of conversation there, and it's really challenging on two levels. One of which is there's an explicit concern around military technology. Yes, but there's also a pretty broad concern around just economic deployment. Economies are also heavily tied to national security in these spaces. And the issue you have with chips is historically when you would go with export controls is you would carve off either just the military application of a dual technology, so you just carve off that top percent and leave the commercial market, or you would have dual use technologies where you would take the commercial hit because they were indistinguishable from each other, that military technology and the civilian technology, but the civilian market was actually quite limited. So your economic application or implications of that were more limited. The problem with semiconductors, as you also have in artificial intelligence, is those two things are still indistinguishable against each other. They're dual use but general purpose, and the commercial market is massive. So the reverberations, even if you're just trying to go after very specific technical use cases, are significant across your economy. So it's very difficult to contain the impact of that much more broadly. So yes, there's a diversity of national security concerns at play. They are not necessarily all aligned. Not all policies apply to all of them, and they often do run into conflict with each other in their implementation. And that's true just internal to the USG across those agencies. I think your second question is spot on, right? Which is talking about the role of alliances. I think no one in this room says alliances, yeah, no, I think we can do without them. Well, I'll just go home at the end of the day. It's perfectly fine. I think there's an understanding that they're critical, and they're critical in a variety of ways. But there's also a series of friction points with our allies. One of those being export controls. These are not uncontroversial, both in their orientation as well as in their blowback and the ways in which they're implemented. The other is sort of asking for some pretty significant economic restructuring in allies, which export controls over the last 4 years did, and some serious economic harm across those industries, as well at the same time as we're imposing other costs through other means. So you do risk, I think, some fracturing and fragmentation there. I'll add you, I think, another variable to your moment of concern, if those two weren't enough, which is also that what we're seeing is the fragmentation of blocks as well, where we're starting to ask for different things from different partners. So we'll be in a meeting with the Japanese and the Dutch, and we'll be asking for very specific things around equipment, for example, manufacturing. And then the South Koreans, and rightly so, are going, hang on. We also compete against the Japanese on a lot of these industries. And more globally, what's our portion of the pie? Where do we fit in? And then we go to the sort of South Koreans and the Japanese, and we ask for very different things. We go to the EU and we ask for completely different things. So there's also a fragmentation across our just collaborative multilateral ecosystem, and that reverberates all the way up. Like on AI governance, how do you address geostrategic concerns with China while also getting China to be an invested partner in AI safety at the exact same time where you're doing those two things?
Thank you. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is John Lee. I'm a student here at Elliott School, and I also wrote a research paper about the long-term impacts of CHIPS Act to South Korean economic and national security here at the GWICS. So this was very interesting. Thank you. And my question is that the Trump administration, as Gwanhoo said, is reconsidering providing subsidies to Korean companies. And Trump seems very confident about attracting global companies to manufacture within the U.S. simply by tariff and not subsidies. But for example, the CHIPS Act comes with the guardrail policies of no joint research and expanding further of their existing semiconductor manufacturing sector in China. But how do you think the tariff? Do you think the tariff will be able to create some of those similar guardrail policies if Trump tried to use tariff instead of subsidies in terms of this geopolitical chip war? And also, Griffith, you talked about the promote aspect instead of protect aspect in terms of this geopolitics. But to be honest, I feel like the main purpose or main focus of the U.S. right now is trying to domestically manufacture or secure domestic manufacturing of the chip sector instead of the joint research aspect. And technically, trying to domesticate the manufacturing sector is not really promoting aspect. It's more like a protect aspect. So how do you think the Trump administration will play out in the next 4 years about this promote aspect?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a tough question. So South Korean semiconductor companies invest in U.S. With the promise that they will get subsidies from the U.S. government, but now that promise may or may not be realized, right? So, but then tariffs alone, I think it will be effective, tariffs alone, in terms of attracting foreign investment, especially South Korean semiconductor companies, to the United States to some extent. But in my opinion, neither tariffs nor the subsidy alone is sufficient for long-term investment from South Korea, especially in semiconductor business. The reason is that semiconductor manufacturing is such a complicated, complex operation. So of course, the cost advantage is a big, appealing factor for investment. But there are all other things you have to consider. For example, supply chain and infrastructure, especially human capital issues, right? So the reason why Taiwanese companies and Korean companies are excelling in the semiconductor industry, part of it is their outstanding human capital, the skills, the operators, the factory, the workers and managers. And then US can provide, we could provide those skills, eventually, but it will take time, right? So whether or not the US education system or vocational, the education system can actually supply those high level skills to, semiconductor companies is also actually a big factor for the investment. So, I don't think this is a direct answer to your question, but the tariffs without subsidies may work, but may not be sufficient for attracting long-term investment because of other infrastructures and skills and the reskilling, upscaling. Those things need to be aligned with the financial incentives. So that's my answer to your question. Thank you.
So I think on the back end of that, this conversation about promote. So there are two different policy toolkits that you would use, right? So you can imagine doing industrial policy at home because you feel other countries are also doing industrial policy. And so you want to be able to see a kind of more equitable outcome for your firms, which to be fair is what has happened, right? I mean, the United States is not alone historically in wanting to intervene on behalf of its semiconductor industry. And you saw that actually in a lot of the reporting on where firms were likely to set up manufacturing facilities, and very, very high was on the incentives provided to them, in addition to the regulatory environments in place. So this kind of promote package of policy tools was quite heavy in that space. I would say if you look at the specific rationale as well as the budget line of the CHIPS Act, it is incredibly small, even compared to the sort of R&D budgets of the semiconductor firms we're talking about annually, but also as compared to other countries. In this space, it is not a lot of money. It is still an incredibly important bipartisan piece of industrial policy, the likes of which we hadn't seen in quite a while, but it was not earth-shatteringly large, which I think is also why you saw such a, at least in their articulation, a long time in terms of rolling out awards in that space, because they were looking to make very, very small targeted interventions in industries that already had significant capital and interest and investment and market viability in that space. So they were actually quite targeted in that regard. But the kind of broader implementation or rollout of that is, I think, an area of uncertainty, and we just don't know where that will likely go. I think to your other point, while there has been significant focus on regaining some of that manufacturing capacity in the United States, and it is very much a regain conversation in that area, it has not been, and I would argue if it became this way, it would be untenable, a conversation about doing everything. at home. One that's just simply impossible in the semiconductor industry as a whole. And a lot of the argument around promote was around resilience components of this. And you would hear a lot of the just one. You can scale from one and you can't scale from zero. So you need sort of just one player at each portion of the stack. I think building off of the kind of conversation that we just had, these are complex ecosystems, this particularly in the semiconductor world, it is the most globally complex and most complex manufacturing process in human history, which is incredibly ambitious when you get into the weeds. But they're also, particularly as you move away from things like design, for example, they're massive capital investments in place, and they tend to be incredibly sticky in that regard. So there's also, I think, a question of when those investments come in and how sticky groups don't tend to pick up and move because of the sort of significance of what they're putting on the ground. This is physical infrastructure in a way that is less true of, for example, software companies, of which things like DeepSeek are, or less true around some of even the kind of application design space that is very heavily software-based across the AI ecosystem. So these tend to be a little bit more stable. They're harder to shift.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah, hi. Please identify.
Hello, I'm Seamus Smith. I'm a senior at the Elliott School. Related to the semiconductors question, I keep on hearing uncertainty being said over and over, and I'm just wondering, with the transition to the Trump 2.0 administration, what could we expect to see with the impact on semiconductor production in Taiwan? I know that South Korea expressed support for Taiwan to join various international organizations at the Munich Security Conference, and also that the U.S. State Department removed anti-Taiwanese and independence language from their site. I'm just wondering, what were your thoughts on that?
So I think what we see from a South Korean perspective on Taiwan, when I was working in South Korea, actually I didn't see the recent news at Munich, but South Korea treated the word Taiwan as if it was Voldemort from Harry Potter. It was very, very, very difficult historically to get South Korean government to say anything about Taiwan. I delivered so many demarches, or my team did over and over, about everything related to Taiwan to try and pull South Korea into doing more on Taiwan. So I'd be surprised to see a big shift in South Korean attitudes towards Taiwan. I don't know what the latest announcement was. So I'll stick with what I know. That doesn't seem to be too uncertain. I think the overall, the Trump approach to China, remains quite unclear, and how that will affect Taiwan also unclear. I think what we were looking at chips, I think the thing that gives me some hope for Taiwan to maintain its leadership role is both the fact that it has such a critical piece of the puzzle, but also because of the work that's been happening over the past years to integrate Taiwan more in the Fab 4, also in these minilateral, plurilateral groupings that Melissa mentioned. I think they have been effective at both shoring up the supply chain related to chips, but also having an added benefit of having increased governmental and business related coordination on chips, but that bringing Taiwan into conversations at the government level that they had not been in previously. So.
And I think I would separate, there's a series of conversations when you raise Taiwan, right? So one is just what's the level of cooperation and coordination. Semiconductors has been a big component of that in terms of bringing Taiwanese industry and Taiwanese government into direct communication. And then the other half of your question is about sort of political recognition and kind of what third rails are no longer third rails and what that means potentially across countries for just the stability of the region, but also the stability of Taiwan in that area, which is, I think, actually a little bit uncertain, and I'm way over my skis here in terms of areas of expertise, but it's unclear whether or not getting that level of attention and recognition is actually a better security environment for Taiwan in the short term. I'm saying a little bit sarcastically. Henry's also shaking his head, if that's actually a good thing for the stability of the country and the region.
Okay, we have only 5 minutes left. So in the interest of time, let me make a bundle of questions this time. So do we have any questions?
So I believe it was Mr. Haggard who mentioned that
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Tyler Yu, and I'm a freshman at the ESIA. I believe you said that like the Korean companies, they kind of stacked over chips in America. But on the reverse, for the American side, South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world, and some people aren't too optimistic about its prospects into the far future. So especially with the United States' foreign policy seeming to become more protectionist, do you think that the level of cooperation between the two parties, if Americans are trying to look out for Americans more, and if the prospects of the Korean economy growing are beginning to stagnate, do you think that the level of cooperation that we're experiencing right now is going to go up, or could there be a possible decline in the future?
You and one more question over there.
Hi, my name is Henry Feng. I'm a sophomore at ESIA. My question is, with the possible increase of demand in energy globally, should US and Korea be concerned of China's possible involvement in increasing their sphere of influence through energy? And if so, how should US and Korea work in collaboration to address that? Thank you.
I'm very happy and proud that we have a lot of questions from GW students. We have one last question. Let me bundle it.
Hi, I'm Sajin from ESIA, and thank you for accepting my last question. It's really as simple as it is. Mr. Haggard, do you expect the bilateral relationship between the ROK and the US be better when our next leader is finally elected? Because in recent months, it has impacted a lot of a dropout of American investment from Korea and like just the currency and like things like that. So what do you expect to be better when our leader is elected? And at the same time, what could be go worse or deteriorate? Thank you.
Yeah. So you can pick any of the questions you want to answer.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. For the U.S., I agree. Good point. Korea is having a lot of issues with its birth rate and suicide and kind of a gender issue. The list is long. The lots, that's. But I don't. What hasn't changed is Korea's position, geography. The United States has our only troops on the Asian mainland are in South Korea. It's one of our strongest alliances. It has partnership with Korea outside of Korea. I think it still has huge growth potential, both diplomatically as well as economically, because Korea can partner with the United States in places and work in places that perhaps Japan, without baggage, like a country like Japan does.
I'll do a very quick sort of answer on energy. Yes, right. I think energy is the prime denominator for all of the technology as well as industries that we're talking about today. And demand is surging and infrastructure build out is not keeping pace. It's no secret when you look at artificial intelligence, this is a very energy hungry industry, and that's only going to get worse, particularly as we move from this, what I would call like an era of innovation where we're heavily focused on building some of the neatest kind of cool innovations in this space, research, for example, and we start moving to deployment quite meaningfully, that energy bill is just going to go up, and we're nowhere close to meeting that delta between the energy we need and the energy we need to deploy. And I think that's both a question of infrastructure build out, and it's also a question of green energy, nuclear being one of them in that space, but also a portfolio as well as moving toward things like microgrids and reshaping our compute landscape and our AI landscape to move more toward the edge. So yes, like energy, I think is going to be the defining feature and potentially the thing that would prevent us from realizing a lot of the ambitions in this room economically, but also in terms of national security. If you don't get energy right, the rest doesn't follow.
One last very quick answer. Sorry, is with U.S. strong leadership in AI space, I think there will be a ton of future collaboration opportunities between South Korea and U.S. So AI, I think, will have a huge impact on the amount of collaboration going on between South Korea and United States going forward. Thank you.
I'll offer a quick optimistic note. Whoever is the next president of South Korea, every South Korean president, since they've been elected, any previous, their first goal, or in diplomatically speaking, is to ensure good relations with the United States. So even if a president had, before Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, Moon Jae-in, there were doubts in America about because they had concerns about their past anti-American rhetoric and otherwise. Turned out that South Korean presidents are constrained by the guardrails that are in place business, diplomacy, alliance, security, and also personal. I mean, there are 3.5 million Korean Americans. There's hundreds of thousands. There's 200,000 Americans, Korea. There's hundreds of thousands of Koreans studying and traveling to the United States at any time. There's too much at stake for any Korean president to ignore the United States relationship, even if it's something they want to do, even if they want to stand up to it. So I'm optimistic. I mean, there are ways it could go better or worse for sure. I think the most important thing is to move on from this time of acting presidency in South Korea and get to a point where the Trump presidency, not just Trump, but the entire, the U.S. government have real counterparts to work with. So I think that's the most important thing. And I remain optimistic that the U.S.-Korea relationship from the Korean perspective has to work. And every president is focused on making it work.
Thank you very much for your very optimistic concluding remarks. Before we wrap up, I just want to say a big thank you to all our distinguished speakers for joining us today. And Gwanhoo, I hope you will feel better soon. And a huge shout out to our staff for making this event happening. And of course, thank you all for being here and making today's discussion so engaging. With that, we'll bring today's event to a close. Thanks again, and take care.